This is Mitrovica, the fifth largest city in Kosovo, a country in the Western Balkans formerly part of Yugoslavia and Serbia. The second part of that sentence is what makes Kosovo such a fascinating place. Saying a word like country when talking about Kosovo or referring to its status as part of Serbia in the past tense might get you in trouble. It might even get you hurt, even if you say it to someone living in the country. Mitrovica is where we start this journey, because Mitrovica symbolizes the struggle that Kosovo has and still endures. Before we went to Mitrovica, we had been warned of its reputation. At a bar the night before, we had told a local where we were headed, and he wished us luck. Mitrovica is a divided city. The river Ibar splits it into north and south, and the two sides rarely, if ever, interact. In the south, 80,000 Kosovar Albanians dominate, as they do in the rest of the country. In the north are 50,000 Serbs. We entered the city from the south, and its streets were similar to those we had seen before, but the face of the city changed when we reached the bridge. Crossing the Ibar stands the new bridge, built in 2001 in an attempt to reconcile the two ethnicities, who just 2 years before had been at war. Ironically, the bridge is now closed to vehicle traffic. On the north side, we could see the iconic Slavic colours, red, white, blue, draped over roads and buildings. Bilingual signs that were everywhere else in Kosovo were written only in Serbian in the north. Graffiti on the walls preached anti-Albanian hate and praised war criminals like Ratko Mladic, the perpetrator of the Srebrenica massacre and genocide in Bosnia. Italian peacekeepers stood at the other end. As we stood on the south side listening to the history, we were approached by a man. He was drunk or high, definitely not sober, and began serenading us in either Albanian or Serbian. Apparently he was so incoherent no one could tell which he was. The only words we could make out were America and Bill Clinton. After mumbling and shaking his arms at us, he walked to the center of the bridge and held out his hand, as if symbolically blocking us from crossing. We crossed anyway, but didn't go too far north. When we did, someone began shouting. The nameless man was being chased from a cafe by someone very angry. In almost an instant, a second batch of Italian peacekeepers drove in, and a wave of Kosovar police officers crossed from the south. It was as if the authorities were ready at any moment. The nameless man was dragged back south and led away. The overwhelming thing I felt in Mitrovica was tension. We were silent when we were there, like everything was resting on a knife's edge. Although the rest of Kosovo is incredibly nationalistic, there was always a sense that, even though things had been horrifically traumatic before, the country was moving forward. But Mitrovica was a reminder that Kosovo's divisions and violent past still haunt the people. Regardless of the nameless man's ethnicity, he was hurting. I don't want to play armchair psychologist, but I can't help feel that living in such a divided place was what was holding him in pain. Mitrovica shows the struggles that Kosovo and its people have endured and still endure. Its future is uncertain, rocky, dangerous, but it still moves forward. And to understand the controversy of its mere existence, we have to go back. Medieval history is incredibly important to the people of Kosovo, both Albanians and Serbs. Each group claims authority over the entire country, and medieval history is how they legitimize it. Unfortunately for the Albanians, most historians believe it was the Serbs that beat them to it, settling Kosovo around the mid-6th century. Albanians, on the other hand, have more mysterious origins. It's believed that Albanians settled the region not long after the Serbs and were ruled over by them. It's also believed that the two groups lived peacefully together during these early centuries. The tribal Serbs in the region were ruled for centuries under the Bulgarians and then the Byzantines, before breaking free around the 12th century and forming the Kingdom of Serbia. It was during these crucial centuries that Kosovo began to become important to Serbian identity. A region rich in gold, Serb Orthodox monasteries and churches decorated themselves with it, and the kingdom's wealth was tied to the exploitation of its mines. Albanians continued to live in the province, loyal to the Serbian crown. In the centuries after breaking free from Byzantium, Serbia had a sharp rise and an even sharper decline. After the death of its Tsar, Stefan Dusan, the kingdom began to dissolve, something which coincided with the rise of another empire, the Ottomans. In the 1300s, the Ottomans would begin conquering the Balkans. Serbia would meet them on numerous occasions, doing battle and attempting to resist their rise. None of these battles would be as important as the Battle of Kosovo-Polja in 1389. The story goes as follows. In June 1389, the Serbian and Ottoman armies met in the field of Kosovo-Polja. At this point, the Serbs had been pushed back. The Ottomans issued an ultimatum: surrender or meet in battle. Tsar Lazar rejected it. The night before the battle, Tsar Lazar hosts a supper with his 12 knights. He tells them all, "One of you will betray me tomorrow." The next day, the two armies meet, and the massive battle begins. In the chaos, a legendary Serbian knight, Milosevic, sneaks behind the Ottoman line and assassinates the Ottoman Sultan himself. Despite this, and Serbia's valiant defense against the outnumbering Turks, Tsar Lazar loses and is himself killed. He was betrayed by his knight, Vuk Brankovic, who let Lazar lose in order to become Serbia's ruler himself. It was a brave last stand against Ottoman hegemony before their conquest of the entire country. The problem with the story is, almost all of it isn't true. Yes, the Battle of Kosovo-Polja happened. Yes, both Sultan Murad I and Tsar Lazar were killed during it, but almost all the other details are fuzzy. For example, the legendary knight Milosevic, who assassinated the Ottoman Sultan, probably never existed. We don't actually know how the Sultan was killed, only that he was killed. And, on top of that, we don't even know who won, or if anyone won for that matter. The current consensus regarding the Battle of Kosovo-Polja is that it was a draw, and wasn't militarily decisive in the conquest of Serbia at all. In fact, Serbia continued to exist independently for another 70 years, and began to dissolve long before the Ottomans showed up. The Battle of Kosovo-Polja is a very obvious biblical tale. Tsar Lazar is portrayed as a Serbian Jesus Christ, with his Last Supper, his 12 knights, his prediction of betrayal, and his death so that Serbia could live. Nevertheless, the Battle of Kosovo-Polja is commemorated to this day as St. Vitus's Day, marking the region of Kosovo as an integral part not only of the Serbian nation, but of Serbian identity itself. According to Serbs, Tsar Lazar, leading an army of Christians, held back the Muslim horde heroically, symbolically acting as the bulwark of Christianity in Europe. As the demographics of Kosovo would fundamentally change in the following centuries, this line of thinking would tear the region apart. In the southwest of Kosovo lies Prizren, Kosovo's second largest city. We arrived after our tour in Mitrovica, a contrast to say the least. Unlike Mitrovica, Prizren is not a divided city. Unlike Mitrovica, ethnic and religious harmony seems to be common. Mosques and Orthodox churches dot the city centre. The overwhelming feeling I got from Prizren was warm and welcoming, a far cry from the atmosphere in Mitrovica. The city centre feels like it was brought straight from the 1500s, with cobblestone streets and unique architecture. Shop fronts and restaurants pouring into the streets gave it an almost Mediterranean feel. Overlooking the city is a view nothing short of breathtaking. Prizren Fortress, built by the Ottomans in the 18th century, sits atop a hill just a 15-minute walk from the city centre. In summer heat, that walk feels more like an hour, but it's absolutely worth it. From it, you can see the entire city, as well as far into the distance, the horizon dotted with the Balkan mountains and wide valleys. Prizren surprised me a lot. Under Ottoman rule, Prizren had become the cultural and intellectual heart of Kosovo. That culture can still be felt today. My expectations for Kosovo, a divided country still reeling from war and ethnic conflict, were nothing like what I saw in Prizren. Under the Ottomans, Kosovo experienced a massive demographic shift. Serbians at the time were almost exclusively Orthodox Christian, and Albanians almost exclusively Catholic. Members of these faiths began emigrating as the Ottoman Empire began to Islamize the region. Policies of Islamization didn't take hold with Serbs, but Albanians converted in huge numbers. Those Albanian Muslims that remained were then encouraged to settle Kosovo. By the end of the 1700s, Kosovo had lost its Serb Orthodox majority and was overwhelmingly Albanian Muslim. However, the late 1800s and early 1900s saw the spread of nationalism across the Balkans. In Serbia, as was the case in most of the region, this nationalism remained tied to ethnic and religious identity. Nationalist Serbs believed in fighting for an independent, orthodox and ethnically pure state. Albanian nationalists, however, pursued a different strategy. Being predominantly Muslim, Albanian nationalist leaders couldn't tie their ideology to religion. After all, the Ottoman Sultan was the spiritual leader of the Islamic world, and attacking him would be haram. So instead, Albanian nationalism remained secular in order to prevent future religious division, a tactic that worked and won many Albanians to the nationalist cause. In 1912, the First Balkan War began. Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria and Greece declared war on the Ottomans and decisively forced them out of the Balkans. Albania was granted its independence, but Kosovo was divided between Montenegro and Serbia. The peace deal, overseen by Britain and Austria-Hungary, did not take the will of the local peoples into account, and borders were drawn to satisfy great power interests, as admitted later on by the British Foreign Secretary of the time. The new Albanian state would only contain half of all Albanians, but Serbia got what it wanted and more. Kosovar Albanians saw Serb rule only as temporary, and that unification with Albania was inevitable, whereas Serbia saw the existence of Kosovar Albanians only as temporary, and that their eradication from Kosovo was inevitable. Serbia would then begin a campaign of systematic genocide and ethnic cleansing in the immediate aftermath of their conquest. World War I provided a brief respite from this, as Austria-Hungary would occupy the region and empower Albanian culture in an attempt to undermine Serbia's influence. But after the First World War and Austria-Hungary's defeat, Kosovo would be integrated into a new nation, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, otherwise known as Yugoslavia. Arriving in the capital of Kosovo, Pristina, the feeling is very much Albanian. However, reminders of the country's past are seen everywhere. Pristina's architecture in the city centre and its outskirts show its communist past, as well as its religious one and democratic present. The Church of Maria Teresa reflects Kosovo's Catholic origins, the Imperial Mosque its Islamic shift, and the National Library its Yugoslav rule. But since independence, modern buildings are beginning to sprout, like the office of the Prime Minister and the Parliament. Pristina's most memorable feature, however, are its dogs. Everywhere you go, there are dogs, all of them the same breed, Shar Mountain Dog. They wander around, uncaring of the people around them, playing, fighting, sleeping. The people of Pristina exceeded my expectations for hospitality. Though the hardened elderly and middle-aged generations remained cold and distant, the youth were always eager to welcome us, in English as well. Wherever we would go, mostly to bars or clubs, we'd be shadowed by a young local who would be keen to converse in English and tell us all about Kosovo. Kosovo's Albanian heritage is on full display in Pristina, but also their desire to be considered European. It's clear that Kosovo's desire for recognition and respect on the world stage is important to everyone. Another very European aspect of Kosovo is the amount they can drink, and that's coming from an Irishman. Pristina's nightlife surprised me, especially for Europe's most Muslim country. But I must say, it was this aspect of the trip I enjoyed the most. Everyone else on the trip would 100% agree that maybe I enjoyed it a bit too much. The concept of Yugoslavia had existed as a dream among South Slavic intellectuals for some time. The Balkans had been a region torn apart by ethnic, religious and cultural divisions for centuries, a fact exploited by various empires to divide and conquer. Therefore, a unified state was necessary to ensure their survival. At the end of World War I, the victorious Entente merged these South Slavic people into one unified kingdom. Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia and Slovenia existed as equal nations with autonomous governments under a central authority. But an issue could be seen in the very name of the state, Yugoslavia, the land of the southern Slavs. Albanians are not Slavic, they're Balkan. And so, within this new Yugoslavia, they lacked that equal status. Instead, Kosovo was granted to the Serbian government as an autonomous province. In the time after World War I, the Serbian authorities would continue their brutal campaign of colonization in Kosovo. Agrarian reform allowed for the expropriation of land from Albanian Muslims, while simultaneously encouraging their emigration to Albania proper. It's unknown how many Albanians were forcibly removed during this time, but estimates range as high as 120,000. As the policy of colonization continued, Serb nationalists were unhappy at how slow it was. Some even began advocating more forceful and violent methods of removing the Albanians. Increasing ethnic tensions in Kosovo led to the rise of Albanian resistance. Peaceful politicians organized under the group Jemiet in an attempt to push through the idea of Kosovo as an equal state, not an autonomous province. This political group was aided by the Kachak, an armed resistance group. Although these groups ultimately, materially failed in their goals, they solidified the sentiment among Kosovar Albanians that Serbian rule would not be accepted. Colonization would continue for some time, until its interruption by the Second World War. In 1941, Yugoslavia was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Bulgaria. To solidify their control, the Axis exploited existing ethnic tensions and hatreds. Kosovo was divided between the three countries, and local Albanians welcomed their new overlords as the lesser evil, who would finally help end Serbian rule. Thus, many Kosovar Albanians would collaborate with the Axis. Mustafa Kruja, the puppet prime minister of Italian-occupied Albania, said, "Efforts should be made to get rid of the Serbian population in Kosovo and Metohija. All indigenous Serbs should be declared as colonists and should be sent to concentration camps in Albania. The Serbian settler should be killed." Between 70,000 and 100,000 Serbs and Montenegrins were displaced or sent to concentration camps under the Axis occupation. In Kosovo, around 10,000 Serbs were massacred, and an additional 72,000 Albanians moved in. During the occupation, both Yugoslav and Albanian partisans operated an effective resistance campaign. Yugoslav and Albanian partisans agreed to give Kosovo the right of self-determination after the war. They could choose whether or not to remain under Yugoslavia. But when the war was over and the dust had settled, this promise was betrayed. The ethnic violence that had consumed Yugoslavia during the war left it in a delicate state. The new communist rulers did not want to anger the Serbs, the country's largest ethnic group. And so Kosovo was once again integrated as an autonomous province into the Serbian Socialist Republic under the central authority of Yugoslavia. It was very possible that, given the chaos and violence that had come before, Yugoslavia could have descended into another ethnic bloodbath. It could have, if not for one man, the one who held it all together, Josip Broz Tito.
Čini mi osobito zadovoljstvo što se nalazim po drugi put pred ovim visokim forumom.
In Balkan and Yugoslav history, no other figure is quite as legendary as Josip Broz Tito. Born in Croatia to Croat and Slovene parents, Tito was a veteran of World War I, fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. During the war, he was imprisoned and sent to a labor camp in Siberia, from which he would escape during the chaos of the Russian Civil War. In 1920, Tito returned to Yugoslavia, where he would join the Yugoslav Communist Party. He would spend his time as an agitator, advocating communist revolution against the Yugoslav monarchy. But his experience during the Second World War was what would propel him to notoriety. During the occupation, Tito led the communist partisans against the Axis forces, eventually forcing them out of the country. The communists, under his control, would then take over the country and establish the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Tito was a brutal autocrat, but he was genuinely popular among everyone in the country. His authority was exercised in a way that would ensure the unity of the nation and promote ethnic coexistence. Therefore, ethnic identities and cultural expression were incredibly repressed. However, today Tito is far more controversial. Although Yugoslavia largely experienced a sort of golden age under his watch, his ethnic policies would eventually lead to catastrophe. His brotherhood and unity policy promoted equal rights between Yugoslavia's peoples, but it failed to address the historical grievances and failed to promote any kind of mutual understanding. His blood transfusion policy attempted to close the economic gap between ethnic groups by investing resources in poorer states, but it failed as regional inequality remained a massive issue. His migration policy encouraged Albanians to move to Kosovo in order to mine its mineral wealth and spur on economic growth. But it failed as increased Albanian immigration only exacerbated ethnic tensions with native Serbs. In many ways, Tito's dream of ethnic harmony began to slowly fade in the last decade of his rule. His failures to create any kind of Yugoslav identity would crash and burn when he finally passed away in 1980. When Tito died, federal authority in Yugoslavia began to crumble rapidly. The granting of increased power to the ethnic republics in 1974 had increased nationalism, and the trend would accelerate. Any united Yugoslav identity completely fell apart, and each individual republic would soon have their governments dominated by ethnic nationalists. In Kosovo, a province that had long felt ignored and mistreated by both the Yugoslav and Serbian authorities, demonstrations began demanding increased autonomy. Under Tito, such demonstrations were usually quelled by granting the Albanians concessions, but the new nationalist Serb authorities did not. Instead, they started whipping up populist nationalist sentiments. Tito's previous policies were denounced as an attempt to keep Serbia weak so that Yugoslavia could be strong. In 1986, the situation worsened when an ultra-nationalist ascended the presidency of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic was everything Tito stood against, a nationalist driven by a cynical desire for power. Under his regime, power was centralized in Belgrade. Moderate voices were removed and replaced with ultra-nationalist loyalists, and the people were encouraged to believe in his populist brand of Serbian nationalism. The Serb authority consumed itself with saving the Serb nation at the expense of the other republics and minorities within. Paramount to this was Kosovo. Milosevic saw Kosovo as an integral part of Serbia, and thus it needed to be cleansed. In 1989, Kosovo's autonomy was revoked, and it was fully annexed into the Serbian state. Elsewhere, the local authorities, themselves now dominated by nationalists, looked worried. Serbia was the largest of the Yugoslav republics, and the other ethnic leaders felt outnumbered and threatened. After all, most of them held large Serbian minorities within their own borders. Croatian leaders, with the support of Bosniak leaders, proposed devolving Yugoslavia into a loose confederation of independent states, but they agreed that any secession of any other republic would have to trigger their own. The stage was set. All it took was one domino to fall for it all to come crashing down. In 1989, on the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo Polja, Yugoslav leaders met at Gazi Mestan for commemoration. Croatian, Bosniak, and other Yugoslav leaders gave speeches of unity and coexistence, but Milosevic gave one quite distinct. He began with the expected calls for unity, solidarity, and cooperation among people, but the speech took a dark turn. Speaking of the battle 600 years ago, he began to refer to Serbia as the defender of Europe and Christianity, an unusual thing to boast about in a secular communist state. He then mentioned the increasing ethnic tensions. Now we are again being engaged in battles and are facing battles. They are not armed battles, although such things cannot be excluded yet. It was as if Milosevic was telling those in attendance, Serbians, Albanians, Croatians, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Slovenes, Montenegrins, Muslims, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, the many diverse peoples of the rainbow nation of Yugoslavia, that violence was coming and Serbia was ready to fight. Whether or not that was his intention, the ethnic leaders took it as a threat. The next year, on December 23, 1990, the first domino fell. Slovenia voted 88.5% in favor of independence and broke away. True to their word, Croatia followed suit. The Yugoslav Central Authority, at this point dominated by Serbs, did not accept this and attempted to bring back control. The Yugoslav wars had begun. Slovenia, luckily, managed to avoid all-out war. Instead, Slovenian forces did battle with the Yugoslav army in Ljubljana over a period of just 10 days. Afterwards, Yugoslav forces were entirely expelled. Croatia, however, was not so lucky. Although Yugoslav and Serbian government forces never officially fought the Croats, the large Serb minority within Croatia rose up and seized control over a third of the country. Their goal? Integration into the Serbian state. It was in Croatia that the tone for the rest of the region would be set. Ethnic cleansing would be carried out by both Croatian and Serbian forces, driven by the now dominant ultranationalists on both sides. In 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared their own independence. It was here that the most brutal front of the Yugoslav wars would break out. Immediately after declaring independence, the Serb minority seized control of 70% of the country, declaring their own independent Republika Srpska. Under their authority, Bosnia would become the site of the most extensive and systematic genocide carried out in Europe since the Holocaust. Serbian nationalists would establish concentration camps to be filled with Bosniak Muslims, Croatians, and any other ethnic minorities. There, minorities were systematically tortured, and ethnic minority women were systematically raped. Massacres occurred all over occupied territory, mainly perpetrated by Serb forces against Bosniak Muslims and Croatians. In just a few years, Yugoslavia transformed from a peaceful, multi-ethnic communist state into hell on earth. Internationally, there was collective horror, but mainly inaction. It wasn't until 1995, after 4 years of brutal war, concentration camps, systematic rape and genocide, that the US and NATO intervened, bombing Republika Srpska into surrender.
America cannot and must not be the world's policeman. We cannot stop all war for all time, but we can stop some wars. We cannot save all women and all children, but we can save many of them. We can't do everything, but we must do what we can. There are times and places where our leadership can mean the difference between peace and war, and where we can defend our fundamental values as a people and serve our most basic strategic interests. My fellow Americans, in this new era, there are still times when America and America alone can and should make the difference for peace. The terrible war in Bosnia is such a case.
In Croatia, 40,000 people were killed. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, 250,000. Most were civilians. In 1995, international and Yugoslav leaders met in Dayton, Ohio, to sign the Dayton Agreement, dividing Bosnia into an autonomous Republika Srpska and the remainder as a multi-ethnic federation. In some ways, the Serbs seemingly got what they wanted. During this time, Milosevic sat eyeing the situation carefully, never officially joining in the fighting. His Serbian government had covertly supported the rebels in both Croatia and Bosnia, but his attendance at Dayton and his public support for peace gave him an international prestige as someone willing to reconcile with rival ethnicities. He became someone that the West believed they could do business with. It was this image Milosevic had cultivated that gave him ample space to pursue his ultimate goal: the reintegration, domination, and Serbianization of what he believed was the birthplace of his beloved nation, Kosovo. On our first day in Kosovo, we visited an exhibition set up by the Kosovo Center for the Rehabilitation of Torture Victims, commemorating the child victims of the Kosovo War. It was a moving exhibit. Children's toys, diaries, and clothes hung in display for all to see, alongside photos from 1998 and 1999. When discussing topics like the breakup of Yugoslavia and the war in Kosovo, it's easy to get consumed with the high politics and international relations of it all. While they're undoubtedly important, it's also important not to forget that, on the ground, people suffered. And this exhibition reminded us that those that did were often the most innocent. The Yugoslav wars and the war in Kosovo were uniquely brutal. They were ethnically driven through ideas of superiority and dehumanization. When you don't believe your enemy is human, this is the result. Accounts described children witnessing massacres of loved ones at the hands of the Serbian police and military, and how they coped with the trauma. Other accounts described those who were not so lucky. Over 1,000 children were killed in the Kosovo War. These are their names. As the war raged in Croatia and Bosnia, resistance continued in Kosovo. Peaceful resistance to Serb rule was popular among Kosovar Albanians. However, a group known as the People's Movement of Kosovo had operated an unpopular armed struggle beginning in 1982. When Milosevic abolished Kosovo's autonomy in 1989, suddenly this idea of violent resistance was attractive. In the early 1990s, the most powerful and influential armed Kosovar Albanian group emerged: the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA. Leading the KLA was a shadowy figure who acted as a kind of moral leader for Kosovo's armed struggle, Adem Jashari. Over the course of the early 90s, and with the support of Western Albanian diaspora, the KLA would grow stronger and stronger, carrying out guerrilla attacks against Serbian police. They operated anonymously, in the shadows. No one in Kosovo knew who was truly a member and who was not. In turn, the Serbs retaliated by suppressing and murdering any who was suspected. In 1997, Albania itself descended into a quasi-civil war. During the chaos, sympathetic army officers began smuggling huge numbers of arms to the KLA, allowing them to ramp up their attacks and expand their operations. Internationally, the KLA was viewed with contempt. The US, EU, and NATO designated them as terrorists operating an illegal campaign of violence. In fact, Bill Clinton's special envoy to the Balkans, Robert Gelbart, visited Pristina in 1998 and condemned terrorist actions in Kosovo. The KLA is, without any question, a terrorist group. Adem Jashari would evade Serbian capture on numerous occasions, adding to his legend among the Kosovo people. In 1998, the Serbs tried again. Jashari was chased through the towns of Kirez and Likošan. Along the way, Serbian police massacred around 26 Albanian civilians, suspecting them of having links to the KLA. On the 5th of March, Jashari was cornered in his compound in Prikaz. Over the course of 3 days, Serbian police, along with special forces and heavy artillery, besieged the compound. What happened during those days has been burned into the Kosovar psyche as the Prikaz massacre. Jashari himself was killed in the fighting, along with his entire extended family of 51 people. The only person to have survived was Jashari's 10-year-old niece. News of the massacre spread almost immediately, causing an influx of Albanians to begin joining KLA ranks. Any leeway afforded to Milosevic had vanished, and the international community was horrified. Violence in Kosovo exploded, leading the UN to declare the region an impending humanitarian catastrophe and a threat to international security. We arrived at the site of the Prikaz massacre in the afternoon. Adem Jashari's compound is now a massive memorial commemorating the victims of the siege. His bombed-out and destroyed home stands surrounded by scaffolding walkways. Inside you can still see the devastation brought on them by the Serbian police. Next to it is a huge statue bust of Adem Jashari's head, and across the field are the graves of those who died, all of the Jashari extended family. A small museum is located just down the road, dedicated to the armed struggle of the KLA. Before we arrived, I expected a somber and sobering memorial to the victims of Serbian crimes. After all, it was the site of a massacre which took place just over 30 years ago. When we got there, I was surprised, to say the least. Instead of silence and reflection, there was laughter and smiles. Several stands stood around the memorial site selling Albanian souvenirs. Ultranationalist images of Greater Albania, flags of Albania, Kosovo and the KLA, and even toy machine guns for the kids. At the site of the graves, each side was flanked by a soldier from the Kosovar army, giving it the look of a tomb of the unknown soldier, but the feel was quite different. Several times I saw, who I assumed were local Kosovar Albanians, approach the soldiers, put their arm around them, and pose for smiling photos. And, what was best of all about this, was the soldiers would put their arm around them too, as if this was a fun tourist attraction for the whole family. The atmosphere at the Adem Jashari Memorial was jovial and fun. I had expected a sort of Holocaust-style memorial, where people were quiet and respectful. But was this any worse or disrespectful? After all, it was the Kosovar Albanians who seemed to be having a good time, and no one seemed to be offended. The massacre was their story, their scar. If they were smiling and laughing and joking at the sight of it, were they any less respectful to the event's gravity? I don't know the answer. What I will say, though, is that what I saw at the Adem Jashari Memorial reflects a larger feeling amongst the Kosovar people. That the past was destructive, traumatic, and all too recent. But the people were not going to let themselves be held back by it. They always seem to be living in the present and looking to the future. Adem Yashari was succeeded by Hashim Thaçi, a man described as charismatic but ambitious. During the course of the war, Thaçi would consolidate himself as the most powerful man within the KLA, allegedly ordering the assassinations of rival KLA leaders. In October 1998, the US issued Milosevic an ultimatum: establish a ceasefire in Kosovo and withdraw all Serbian security units, or NATO would be forced to intervene. Milosevic agreed, but the ceasefire lasted only a few months. Massacres of Albanian civilians would resume shortly after. During the chaos, a diplomatic solution was trying to push through. In France, delegates from both Belgrade and Pristina met to discuss a solution. The subsequent Rambouillet document would in theory protect Serbia's territorial integrity, while simultaneously guaranteeing an independence referendum for Kosovo in the future. The Kosovar delegation signed. The Serbs didn't. It was there in France that diplomacy in Kosovo died. Serbian atrocities would not slow down. Echoing their tactics in Bosnia and Croatia, Serbian forces carried out a campaign of forced removal, murder, rape, and ethnic cleansing. On the 24th of March 1999, against international law, NATO began bombing Serbia. On the ground, taking advantage of a weakening Serbian military, the KLA began a massive offensive, eventually forcing all Serb forces from Kosovo. The bombing lasted 78 days, ending in Milosevic's surrender in June 1999. He agreed to fully withdraw Serbian troops and allow NATO peacekeepers to enter. The International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, established to prosecute war criminals in the region, issued indictments for almost all of the top Serbian leadership for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Slobodan Milosevic would become the first leader of a sovereign nation to be indicted by international courts. Just a year after the end of the war, the Serbian people rose up, fed up with the constant abuse of human rights, the assassination of opponents, the censorship of media. Milosevic was forced out in October 2000, replaced by a new democratic government. He was then sent to The Hague to answer for his crimes where, to much of the world's dismay, he died in 2006, shortly before the end of his trial. Though the war was comparatively shorter than other Yugoslav wars, the destruction and devastation was massive. Here are the numbers from the UNHCR and Human Rights Watch. 120,000 homes were destroyed. 12,000 Albanians, most of them civilians, were killed. 10 to 20,000 Albanian women and girls were raped. 1.5 million became both external and internal refugees, around 80% of Kosovo's entire population. The end of the war signaled a new age for Kosovo, the first in its history where self-determination would be possible, but things would complicate, mainly due to the actions of one nation. But to understand what happened, we first have to go back. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 left Russia a weak, poor, and humiliated nation. After centuries of being one of the deciding players on the world stage, suddenly Russia was forced to play second fiddle to the West. After defining themselves through their opposition to Western capitalism in a bipolar world, how would they define themselves now that they claimed to be the very capitalist democracy they fought so hard against? Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, had one idea: become an equal partner to the West in a new multipolar world. In pursuing this, Yeltsin attempted to integrate Russia within international institutions like the UN in a far more comprehensive way than had been done under the Soviets. However, the US saw it differently. The end of the Cold War emboldened the US. They saw themselves as the leaders of a new, democratic, free world order. To them, Russia was seen as impeding this goal, advancing the interests of those opposed to it. During the wars in Croatia and Bosnia, Russia was one of the signatories to the Dayton Agreement, influencing the final settlement and ensuring that Russian troops would be stationed in the countries as peacekeepers. Russia, during these negotiations, saw itself as a necessary counterbalance to Western hegemony, which Yeltsin believed was truly needed in order to introduce a real multipolar world. The West saw this as simply trying to advance Serbian aims. The wars in Croatia and Bosnia were a trial run for Russia's new foreign policy, though at the time they were too weak to influence much of significance. The real test came in Kosovo. Would the West take Russia's voice seriously? Would they listen to their concerns for international law? In short, they didn't.
Агрессия против суверенной Югославии серьезно осложнила международный климат. Мир столкнулся с очередной попыткой утвердить диктат силы.
NATO intervention in Kosovo was technically illegal under the UN Security Council, and Russia resented this. It was seen as another unilateral action from a power that believed itself above international norms. Russia demanded that their troops be permitted in Kosovo at the end of the war as peacekeepers alongside NATO. NATO denied them, and in response closed off airspace in Bulgaria and Romania to Russian troops, essentially cutting them off from Kosovo. What followed would be one of the world's most tense standoffs. On the 11th of June 1999, Russia sent paratroopers from its peacekeeping force in Bosnia towards the Serbian border. At 10:30 a.m., they crossed the border and headed south. When NATO heard about this movement, they knew exactly where they were going. They were going to Pristina Airport, the only airport in Kosovo. NATO troops were scheduled to enter Kosovo on the 12th, but the plans changed. Hearing about Russia's possible intentions, NATO High Command ordered British and Norwegian troops stationed in Albania to move in immediately and take the airport before the Russians. When NATO troops arrived in the afternoon of the 12th, it was too late. The Russians had already seized the airport. Over the course of the day, the world held its breath as NATO troops stood off against the Russians. American General Wesley Clark issued an order to attack and destroy them. On the ground, British Captain James Blunt received the order. He refused. British General Mike Jackson called Clark. "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you," he said. After a tense few hours, it was apparent the Russians were not prepared. Their supplies began to run out while negotiations carried on between Russia and the West. But in the end, the gamble paid off. The West allowed Russia to station peacekeepers alongside the newly established NATO Kosovo force, KFOR, as well as allowing them, and, by extension Serbia, a bigger voice in the post-war negotiations. Russia would use this voice to make opposition to the partition of Serbia a priority. Although there were many not-so-valid ones, Russia did make many valid complaints, including the lack of action by KFOR to prevent ethnic cleansing against Serbs, and the lack of prosecution from the ICTY of KLA war criminals. Russia's role in the peace process, however small, would set the deadlock that would dominate future relations between Serbia and Kosovo. If you look up Kosovo's tourist attractions, one of the most popular is one that might surprise you. In the center of Pristina stands a 10-foot tall statue to 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton, located off the similarly named Bill Clinton Boulevard. This was the first sign we saw of Kosovo's America fever. Everywhere in the capital are US flags and signs of American culture. Even Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, had a small statue. According to our host as well, since 1999, thousands of children have since been named Clinton or Tony Blair. For a country overwhelmingly Muslim, it was surprising, but understandable. America and the West are seen as saviors in Kosovo, the ones who allowed them to become independent and free. If it weren't for them, there wouldn't be a Kosovo, as the locals see it. Serbia and Kosovo remember the 1990s as painful and miserable. After the war in Kosovo, the last of the Yugoslav wars, what was needed was reconciliation. Unfortunately, it didn't come. When the Milosevic regime fell, a new democratic one took its place under Prime Minister Zoran Djindjic. Djindjic had fought long and hard for Serbian democracy, leading the bulldozer revolution that would eventually topple Milosevic. His administration regarded Kosovo, as almost all Serbs did, as an integral part of Serbia. He supported their reintegration with a degree of autonomy, as it had been under Tito. However, he would always emphasize the need for a diplomatic solution to the dispute, and respected his Kosovar Albanian counterparts. Under Djindjic's administration, Serbia seemingly was heading towards democracy and integration within the rest of Europe. But in 2003, Djindjic was killed by a leftover special military faction from Milosevic's regime with the help of the Serbian mafia. Milosevic's corruption and kleptocracy had allowed for the growth of these organized crime factions, and in the end they managed to stop any meaningful democratic reforms. After Djindjic, successive and increasingly nationalist governments would be swept into power. Today, Serbia's president is Aleksandar Vučić, who previously served as Milosevic's Minister of Information during the Kosovo War. In other words, Milosevic's former propaganda minister, responsible for spreading genocide denial, ethnic hatred, and censorship of criticism. Vučić's regime is currently characterized by high degrees of media censorship and bias that makes it impossible to conceive of any opposition victory in the future. After freeing themselves from Serbian rule, Kosovo would build a democratic state with heavy international supervision. Political parties emerged from the various factions that fought for independence, leading to a competitive and peaceful democratic system. In 2008, Kosovo would declare itself independent in a referendum declared legal by international law. In many ways, Kosovo's trajectory since the end of the war has been the opposite of Serbia's. Kosovo's democracy has grown steadily more and more healthy and robust, having numerous peaceful transitions of power. However, there remains many key issues holding Kosovo back. Corruption remains widespread, as the influence of organized crime continues to flourish. Today, Pristina is considered the headquarters of the Albanian mafia, a fact that infects politics from time to time. Ethnic tensions are still raw and have the potential to flare up, a fact made worse by a seeming lack of reconciliation on the part of Kosovar Albanians. Many members of the KLA were involved in horrific crimes against humanity during the war, a fact that many ordinary Kosovars are reluctant to admit. In recent years, efforts have been made to prosecute such people. Even Hashim Thaçi himself, who was serving as Kosovo's president when he was indicted by The Hague in 2020. As well as this, Kosovar Serbs feel themselves discriminated against by the Albanian majority. Serbian majority areas are politically separate from Albanian majority areas, feeling themselves under threat from an alien enemy. While the Albanian majority enjoys pluralistic democracy, the Serbian minority suffers from political intimidation and interference from the Serb List party, a party with links to the Serbian government. In 2023, local elections in Serb-majority areas were boycotted in protest, leading to turnouts of as low as nearly 1% and resulting in ethnically Albanian mayors being elected. Despite this, the Kosovar government allowed these Albanian mayors to take office, ignoring the blatantly almost non-existent turnout. Riots would ensue, resulting in the injuries of about 15 protesters and police. But these issues are underlined by a larger crisis perpetually facing Kosovo: its existential fight to exist. Nearly 100% of the Kosovar government's effort is spent trying to convince the world of its right to exist as a free and independent nation. So far, 102 members of the UN recognize it as such, with notable exceptions including China and Russia. Kosovo's most staunch allies have historically come from the West. The US, Kosovo's liberator, has pledged military support in the form of KFOR. The European Union, diplomatic support in the form of the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, an initiative seeking to normalize relations between Kosovo and Serbia. The talks have been mostly progressive. Serbia and Kosovo have since agreed to resolve many issues, such as customs, movement of people, and bureaucracy. But it's been argued the talks aren't meaningful. One of Serbia's terms for joining the negotiations was a guarantee that recognizing Kosovo's sovereignty was not on the table. That's why they're called the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, not the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue. According to an article from the New Policy Center and Project on Ethnic Relations, the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue lacks any meaningful incentive for both sides to cooperate. Both Serbia and Kosovo are merely motivated by self-interest in the discussions. Self-interest that is at odds with each other. Serbia, motivated by a desire to join the EU, has engaged in the discussions seemingly cordially, but only as much as is necessary. Kosovo, motivated by the hopes of normalizing itself on the world stage, has too, but only so long as Serbia remains non-threatening and thus weak. To appease the EU, both Serbia and Kosovo sit around the table and talk, while behind the scenes, neither of them will trust each other so long as they perceive the other as a threat. In recent years, the negotiations have stalled. Kosovo is not the attractive new democracy the West had championed all those years ago. Although it's made political and economic progress, Serbia's staunch opposition remains a barrier. And so the West is beginning to question its support. Although both Kosovo and Serbia are in relative demographic decline, Serbia still remains the larger, more attractive business partner. And as the US and the West becomes ever more engaged in conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Taiwan, and elsewhere, Kosovo is looking like a less and less important ally every day, and Serbia knows this. Kosovo is a beautiful country, full of welcoming people, a distinct culture, and a vibrant youth. It has potential to shine if given the chance. But 2023 has tested its resolve. From the election riots in the north back in May, and the subsequent brawl in Parliament soon after, to the almost certainly Serbian-backed Banska monastery shootout, which claimed 4 lives, and the immediate Serbian military build-up that followed. Kosovo has been, and still is, in an existential fight to exist. International support secured them that right, and saved them from potential annihilation. It would be a shame if we turned our back now. I'd like to thank the Kosovo International Summer Academy, its founder, Dr. Labinot Hajdari, Dr. Judita Krasniqi, and everyone else involved in this wonderful experience that allowed for the creation of this video. The Kosovo International Summer Academy is a 10-day conference learning from experts in the field of diplomacy, international relations, political science, journalism, and more. If you like the kind of videos I make and are interested in learning more about Kosovo and the region, I can't recommend applying enough. Not only will you be able to learn more academically, but you'll also be able to make lifelong friendships with people from all around the world. You'll also be able to experience Kosovo, its vibrant culture, welcoming people, and insane nightlife. Thank you so much to the Kosovo International Summer Academy. If you're interested in applying, the link is in the description below, and applications for the 2024 program this summer are open right now. I'd also like to thank my university, University College Dublin, for sponsoring me to go on this trip. This video would not have been possible without them. Thank you all for watching and being patient with me. Hopefully the next video won't take a year. If you'd like to support what I do, consider donating to my Patreon.